Hello, welcome back to another video. In today's video we're going to be looking at composition and examining ways that we can use the frame of the camera to organize the information that we see into something that's pleasing. Good composition is something that sets apart compelling photography from sloppy, amateurish photos. It's true, professional photographers often use very complex technical gear that's very expensive and requires a lot of knowledge to know how to use properly. But without a solid grasp of composition, even photos made with expensive gear will fall flat. So in this video, we're going to begin looking at ways that you can compose images that will grab your viewer's eye and hopefully keep their attention. One of the first things to consider when composing an image is perhaps the most obvious. It's the frame of the viewfinder itself. With most digital cameras today, whether it's your cell phone or a DSLR or a mirrorless camera like this one pictured here, most of them, while they have different size sensors inside, they're usually about the same proportions. So the shape of your frame will be very similar. But there are other cameras people shoot with today, even old ones such as this Deardorff large format camera. This particular one shoots an 8 by 10 inch sheet of film, which is significantly larger than any digital sensor that you could buy today. Here's another example of a classic film camera that shoots a square format of 6 by 6 centimeters square. Here's a film camera designed for shooting panoramas that shoots a 6 by 17 centimeter negative, which translates to about 2¼ by 7 inches wide. So these are very different shapes and proportions of frames. The next question to ask is, how is this frame oriented? Is it oriented vertically, horizontally? Often you'll hear people refer to these orientations as landscape or portrait, but I think that those terms are confusing. When I hear someone say that they shot landscape, I'm thinking that they shot pictures of rocks or mountains. When someone says they shot something portrait, I'm looking for pictures of people. So those terms really refer to genres of photography, not orientations for the camera. Here's an example of horizontally oriented frame, and it's quite wide. It's significantly wider than it is tall. This shape of frame gives you a lot of room to organize things from left to right. Here's another example of an even wider frame. This is from the same backpacking trip that I took a couple years ago with my wife to climb Mount Whitney. And here's an example of a vertical frame. This is from the brand new book, Let the Sun Beheaded Be by Gregory Halpern, who's known for shooting a lot of vertical frames. You can see with a vertical frame, even when the subject matter has movement laterally from left to right, the emphasis is on the verticality of what's in the frame. Here's an image of mine, which is an even narrower frame, and when used with the vertical subject matter, it emphasizes the vertical lines in the image. Here's a famous example of a square format. This was from one of the NASA lunar missions in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Here's an example of an image that's not quite square, but it feels square compared to the rectangles that we're used to in movies and television. This is from the Polish film Ida, which came out in 2013. It's full of beautiful composition, so I definitely recommend checking this one out. And we'll be looking at more images from this later in the video. So where should you place things in the frame? Keep in mind, photography, unlike other mediums, is subtractive. We start with what we see in front of us, and we're usually thinking more about what do I need to take out that's unnecessary or confusing or distracting. What do I need to remove in order to have something that will keep someone's attention and or communicate the things that I'm interested in? Other mediums like painting, illustration, drawing tend to start from something blank and add things to it. So it's a very different way to work and think about the final image that you're after. Some rules to consider, or perhaps suggestions is a better term. When it comes to composition, I don't like to use the term rules because it makes it sound as though you must compose your images this way, and if you don't, it's a bad photograph. I think it's a better way to think of them as suggestions, and when you understand how these suggestions and these principles work, then you know the effect they'll have on your viewer, and then you can choose to use them or break them depending on the effect that you want. But what's most important is to understand the effect they'll have on the photograph, how it's interpreted, and choose your composition style or strategy based on the effect you want it to have on your viewer. First off, and most obvious, we could center it. This is a very stable, strong, bold way to compose things. It's very straightforward. Here's a classic example from the Stanley Kubrick film 2001, Technically, the subject matter is not quite centered in it, but it's very, very close. Here's another example from the same film. And again, as with many photos, there's a lot of other things going on, but what we see in the center when we look into the portal of the capsule that the two characters are seated in, we can see the infamous supercomputer HAL lurking in the background. In this example, we see not only a square frame, but the subject matter is centered here. This is from the photo book The Afronauts by Christina de Medel. Another suggestion, we could place things off to the sides of the photograph. Here's another example from 2001. In this photograph, we have a square frame, and the main action of the photograph is the skateboarder off to the left, and his direction of travel has him going down through the bowl to the right. And he's sort of counterbalanced by the spectator here looking at him, so we see the implied gaze going this direction. Here's another example from the film Ida. In this instance, we have a frame that's almost square, not quite. It's a little bit wider than square. And you see the characters are placed way at the bottom of the frame. They're not quite centered. Ida herself is centered. The other character is a little to the left of her, but they're very close to the edges of the frame. Another suggestion, this is usually referred to as the rule of thirds, but since we're calling it a suggestion, the best way to understand it as the intersection of thirds. So what do we mean by that? If we take a frame, in this instance, a still from the film A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick, if we divide it into equal thirds, where the thirds intersect is where we ought to place the subject matter that interests us. So here I've divided the frame into thirds, and you can see right here where these thirds intersect, we see the main character's face. And his gaze happens to be looking down to the opposite intersection of thirds here. Here's another example from the same film. We take this frame, divide it into thirds. Again, we have the main character on this intersection of thirds, and you can see that their implied eye line is traveling to this adjacent intersection of thirds right here. Another suggestion would be to use frames within frames. Here's a classic example from Lee Friedlander called Route 9 West, New York, 1969. In this image, we have the frame of the side view mirror of his truck. We have the frame of another part of the window here. We have a frame from these power lines here. And we have a frame of this curb or the edge of the parking lot that's used to frame this little God Bless America shrine. If he had stepped out of the car and taken this photograph, there may have been other content in the image to give it some interest to us, but it's much more complex and dynamic using these frames and these multiple planes. Here's an example from the street photographer Vivian Meyer. In this case, we're seeing pedestrians walking and their shadows underneath her viewpoint, but it's framed by the edge of this structure and the shadows at the bottom. Here's another. Her focus is here on this man, but he's framed by the silhouette of this figure and all the other people around him, the edge of this roof line. Some more stills from the film Ida. In this case, she's framed by the arch of this entryway. Here she is framed by the curve of the stairwell and the handrail. And lastly, one more. We have another character from the film. He's framed by the railing of the bed here, which isolates him from the other characters in the scene. That wraps up for this video. In the next one, we'll look at other strategies for how to guide your viewer's eye through the frame.